The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear. And the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist. But we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome. We're back again for another episode of Arcane Radio, where we explore the unexplained here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. I'm your host, Lon Strickler, coming to you within a cannon shot of historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I thank you for joining me. Now, before we start talking to our guest, I want to talk about a recent report that we received with the team where a witness observed a tall human-shaped being in a preserve near O'Hare International Airport. Now, the description is interesting since it is near several other winged humanoid sighting locations. Now, I recently talked to two women who have had an encounter with an unknown entity in this forest preserve located near Rosemont, Illinois. LJ later forwarded the following written report. Now, my friend and I were biking north on a closed Cook County Forest Preserve trail near Rosemont on December 8, 2019 at around 2 p.m. Central Time. Now, I believe we entered the trail on the north side off of Lawrence Avenue into the Catherine Chevalier Woods. We walked our bikes at this point because the trail was muddy. Now, it was along the Des Plaines River. Maybe a quarter mile later, the trail hooked up with a more official-looking bike trail. Now, after a few minutes on that trail, I was overcome with an immediate sense of anxiety and doom. About 30 to 50 yards away on the right side of the trail, I swear I saw something that was about 6 to 7 foot tall, with its back mostly towards us, but slightly facing east. It looked like the back was covered in feathers or some scraggly-looking light brown or gray coat. It looked kind of hunched over. I thought it was just my imagination and didn't say anything to my friend about it at the time, and tried to focus on the conversation we were having at the time while biking. I felt nervous biking toward it and was not looking at it as we biked in this direction, thinking it was just my imagination, but I felt worried. Now, later that day, a friend texted us jokingly to say that there were a number of Mothman sightings in the area we had biked earlier that day. That's when I felt my heart sink. Now, we didn't know much about this being before we found your site when researching the Mothman after we got back from our bike trip. Now, she attached some Google Earth images to show the specifics and such. And they also sent a photograph that her friend took of her right before the sighting. So anyway, the witness is a known professional in Chicago. And the location is east of O'Hare International Airport. Now, I know the area somewhat since it's in a nature preserve behind the convention center and the Lowe's Chicago O'Hare Hotel, places I've been while I visited Chicago. Now, the Des Plaines River is directly behind the convention center and the hotel. For some reason, I personally believe that this may be a key location for whatever reason. And one of our team is investigating the area. So we get any follow-up, I will report it. Manuel Navarrete, who's one of our team investigators, will be going out there. He's already talked to the witnesses, and they're going to arrange something to go out there together. but we have had sightings near that area. So I don't know. Hopefully we're going to get some more answers, but it's part of what we do. Anyway, tonight I welcome paranormal researcher, author, lecturer Chad Lewis to Arcane Radio. Now, Chad has a background in psychology and earned a bachelor and master's degree in this field. But for the last 20 plus years, he has traveled the globe in search of unique and bizarre stories in history. From tracking vampires in Transylvania and searching for the elusive monster of Loch Ness to investigating ghosts in Ireland's haunted castles and London's underground, Chad has scoured the earth in search of the paranormal. He has authored over 20 books on the supernatural and extensively lectures on his fascinating findings. The more bizarre the legend, the more likely it is that you'll find Chad there. His latest book is titled Windigo Lore, Monsters, Myths, and Madness. So, Chad, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, great to be back.
Man, it's great talking to you. I guess it's been over a year, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we did Big Muddy Monster last time, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I think so. Now, this book, I tell you, what fascinates me about this book is that the Wendigo is not a subject that I'm well versed in. Now, of course, I do get some reports where people claim that they have encountered one of these beings or seen one of these beings. But, I'm kind of left hanging out there trying to figure out if that's what they actually witnessed. So first of all, what is a Wendigo?
Well, there are two different Wendigos, if you will. One is a modern Wendigo, which is much different than the traditional lore. Now, the traditional lore tells of the Wendigo in three forms, and the most terrifying form would be its flesh and blood, where it's some sort of supernatural-esque creature, often very tall. Reports going from anywhere from 8 feet tall to taller than trees. If it wants to, it can grow as much as it eats. It's often very thin, very skeletal looking. It's gaunt. It's often missing its mouth and its lips as it's chewed them or consumed them in its insatiable hunt for human flesh. It is said to have a paralyzing voice that if you hear the Wendigo, you will be frozen in fear, and then it will be able to devour you quicker that way. But it also comes in the form of a spirit being where it can possess you and slowly turn you into a Wendigo as well. And I think for me, that's the most terrifying part of it, is that you could actually be possessed by this thing and then slowly turn into this cannibalistic monster that hunts human flesh.
Well, before we get into some of the legends and traditional accounts, I do want to ask you one thing. I have been, for a few years now, myself and other researchers and investigators have been receiving these sightings of these emaciated, pale humanoids, or rakes, they want to call them, flesh gates, crawlers, or whatever you want to name them. Is there a possibility that there's any connection with this?
A lot of people note the similarities between these new versions of monsters and the old Wendigo. That a few years back, a couple brothers in Spooner, Wisconsin, which is in the Northwoods, were at a old historic summer camp. And on separate nights, both separately spotted a creature that they had no idea what it was. Same thing as what you probably get a lot of reports of. Very tall, very thin, very menacing creature staring at them. They had no idea what it was. Went home, started researching, had never heard of the Wendigo before, but when they started finding images of drawings and likenesses of the Wendigo, they said that's exactly what they spotted, because there's no other creature that really resembles it throughout cryptozoology, of that tall, thin, menacing claws, often a zone of fear around it. So a lot of people, I don't know if they're seeing it nowadays, but it's the only reference they have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when they come to me and tell me about this, of course they probably been digging a bit on Google and they're coming up with this Wendigo legends, and they're automatically assuming that's what they saw. And I don't know. I guess maybe a few of them may possibly be that, but it's just another enigma that we're faced with, and maybe we're dealing with an absolutely different type of entity.
It certainly seems to be, because the Wendigo in traditional lore was attached to not only the weather, the environment, but also starvation and famine and food shortage. And it was tied to the blizzards, the cold, and that mental, just the mental toughness of surviving in one of the most brutal areas in North America. It was tied to that. And these other reports, I'm getting reports. I received one from South Dakota, somebody believing they captured a sighting of a Wendigo creature. So again, I don't know if they're different creatures or these things have morphed and progressed. I'm also getting reports nowadays of the more traditional thought-looking Wendigo with the antlers and the more deer-like. So when people see years ago what they would have called a deer man or a deer woman, half human, half deer-like, they often refer to that as Wendigo because of the more popular representation of it with antlers.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I have received also. I think in the past several years, I've probably received 2 or 3 humanoids with antlers, and the first thing the witness is saying, that's a Wendigo. Well, I don't know. I think most of these were down in the South. That's not traditionally the area where the Wendigo is known for. Can you tell us where it is known for?
The Wendigo started with the First Nation people of Canada, the Algonquin, which is a series of different tribes sharing a similar language. And even though the views of each tribe could be tremendously different, they all believed in this large, giant creature. And shamans could fight the creature. They could also summon it. So you could summon the Wendigo to a different tribe or village that you were warring with and either have it devour that community or scare off all the game in that community, so that community then would then starve to death. So it was a First Nation story originally and has slowly spread its way through the Great Lakes region of the United States and even out on the eastern coast of the northern eastern portion of the U.S. But that's mainly where it went, through Canada and the Great Lakes region of the United States here. And being that I grew up in Wisconsin, I heard stories of the Wendigo growing up, but unless, like you and I were talking about earlier, that unless you grew up in the Great Lakes, you probably may not have heard of the Wendigo, or if you did, you would have known a few little tidbits about it, but there wasn't a lot of substance on it.
Yeah, and I've talked to several people who live in that area and in Canada, and a lot of them are not familiar with it as well. They've heard of it. They heard of either the Cree or Chippewa or Ojibwe, in their legends and their lore, but that's about all they know.
And it sticks with people here. A few years back, I did a program in northern Minnesota, way up by the Canadian border. And after the program, a woman in her 80s came up to me and told me that as a young girl in the area, she recalled that her father used to warn her and all the other kids playing together that if they ever heard a kettle being banged in the woods, they needed to get home as fast as they could, because that meant the Wendigo was coming and that it was smashing its kettle, announcing its arrival. And she told me that even though she never heard the sound of the kettle in the woods, the story stuck with her 70 plus years later, like it just happened the day before. That's how important the Wendigo was or is in the Great Lakes region.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's almost like your boogeyman,
Yeah, it really was. It was get home before the boogeyman or the Wendigo came to get you.
So, some of the legends that you wrote about, well, and they're not really legends because they involve real people who seem to have been possessed by this Wendigo spirit because of either hardship, starvation, some type of metamorphosis that caused them to change. Can you talk about a few of these?
Yes, and that's the angle we took with this book, that if you go on any academic journals, websites, you'll find tons of articles about the Wendigo, all of them mostly looking at it from the view of sociology or anthropology and looking at it from a very academic lens, not looking at it from a paranormal lens, where we believe that when people explain these stories and wrote about them and documented them, that we have no reason to believe that they weren't being truthful, that they really believed these stories. And if any of your listeners have ever heard of the Wendigo, most likely the story that they've heard bits and pieces of is that of Swift Runner. Swift Runner is perhaps the most infamous story of a person turning Wendigo. And of course, Swift Runner was a Cree. He was a trapper and hunter living in Alberta, Canada, north of Edmonton. And this was in the winter of 1878 and 1879. And Swift Runner was this tall, 6'3" strapping man. He was about 40 winters of age when this happened. And he had his family with him. And what normally would take place for these tribes is that in the summer, they would have a huge community. They would all live together. But when winter sprung up, they would go into these little pods far away in these family structures because game would be spread out more and they'd have a better chance of surviving, not feeding 150 people. So Swift Runner went off to his winter hunting grounds and bad things began happening to the point where he was with his wife and their 6 children and his mother and his brother. And they ended up splitting off, and Swift Runner started going crazy from starvation. He ended up killing his entire family and then consuming their bodies over that winter. His first kill, if you will, was his son that he shot, and then he had to stab him. And then he met back up with his wife and took out the rest of the children and his wife, except one son that he traveled with. The rest of the winter, that one son had to consume his siblings and watch his father murder the family, knowing deep down that he was the next to go. And then Swift Runner, when spring came along, he went down into a community and said, I have a terrible story to tell. My family starved to death out in the elements. And everyone looked at him and thought, he doesn't look like he's been starving. He looks healthier than ever. So authorities had him lead him back to his winter quarters, and that's when they found this virtual graveyard of his family that had been consumed and murdered.
So, I mean, and now generally, is this similar to other stories that have, come up about Wendigo possession?
It is in the manner of Swift Runner reported several of the same symptoms that a lot of other people who believed they were going Wendigo or turning Wendigo would report: hallucinations or seeing things, calling out and groaning and pain and making odd noises, being quiet and withdrawn, personality changes, apathy, being depressed. And Swift Runner said that he actually was possessed by the devil or the Windigo, and that made him do it. That once he shot and ate the last of his children, he had fully become the Windigo and was no longer human. And he was actually tried, convicted, and ended his life at the end of a gallows for the murder of his family, which he blamed on the possession of the Windigo. So a lot of these cases of the Windigo or someone turning Windigo, they would often beg to be killed because they were afraid that once they turned Windigo, they were going to harm and kill and consume their family and loved ones. So they begged, kill me before I turn Wendigo.
So how did the press back in those days handle these stories?
Oh, it seems like we have not progressed much in the last couple hundred years because the press looked at those as savage beliefs of primitive people that they often acquainted it with devil worship and being savages, that
Right.
these people knew no better. And oftentimes it did play out to the benefit of some of these people that were brought to a trial, because at trial, they would often say, we knew nothing of the white man's law. Many of our tribes people had never seen a white person. So when the white law would hear about these murders, as they called them, these people killing the suspected Windigo, they would often try to make an example and go arrest these people. And the tribes people would go along with them thinking, we've done nothing wrong. We have nothing to fear. But the newspapers were brutal, completely racist, completely downplaying any real belief that these things could be real. Again, they just saw it as these uneducated savages living in primitive times.
Wow. Now, of course, we know about other tribes and other areas that have these types of legends or these type of paranormal beings. Just say the Skinwalker, for instance, where it's a witch or something to do with the occult that transforms into something else. Is that can that kind of be equated to what happens with those who go Wendigo?
The Wendigo seemed to have supernatural powers. Not only could it manifest itself in any size it wanted, it was impervious to any elements. It never got cold. It needed to eat, but that seemed to be more of a spiritual requirement than actual sustenance. And it could shapeshift. Many cultures were fearful that the Wendigo would appear often as an owl, that if an owl appeared in the community, it was either the Wendigo or a spy for the Wendigo. There's often also reports of mysterious black dogs that would roam into a community, and the villagers or tribesfolk would believe that those dogs were the Wendigo in its form, as that it could shapeshift into any form it wanted to. Almost like the shapeshifters or even the trickster. There's a lot of trickster components in the Wendigo as well. And a lot of the folklore or more fantastical stories of the Wendigo, where it was outsmarted or a weasel ran up its anus and ate it from the inside out. Those type of stories seem to fit in more of the trickster category.
There does seem to be a lot of these harbinger sightings of other animals or actually transformed entities that precede these suspected sightings. And it's interesting you mentioned the owl, because a friend of mine and I were actually talking tonight about most First Nations tribes kind of see the owl as a harbinger, something not good to come, and the black dog as well. That that is like a harbinger. So I suspect that's kind of the idea what they're thinking. As far as the Wendigo is concerned.
And in northern Minnesota in the 1800s and early 1900s, the Wendigo was thought to be a death omen, one of these harbingers of death. That there was a white pioneer that lived up there by the name of Jake Nelson, and he wrote detailed reports in his journal about the beliefs in that area of a place called Indian Village of the Wendigo, that if the Wendigo was spotted or if you heard it or saw it, much like hearing the Irish Banshee and numerous other cryptids, that it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. And sure enough, Jake Nelson reported that each and every time it was spotted in that village, someone died the very next day because of the Windigo. So the Windigo in northern Minnesota was seen as this death omen.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at your book, and some of these pictures are amazing. And you actually went to a lot of these locations, didn't you?
I did. And myself and my co-author, Kevin Nelson, we visited these places. One of our favorite places is a place called Lake Windigo in northern Minnesota, just east of Bemidji, which is Paul Bunyan country for those of you not in the Midwest. And they have a place called Lake Windigo. It's on an island in a lake, which makes it an anomaly in itself. And many believe the island is haunted and the lake. There are numerous legends. One of my favorite stories tells of people going out to the island, and the women set up base camp and started cooking, and the men went into the heart of the woods to search for game. And when they never returned that night, the next day, the concerned women went to look for them, and they found them skinned up, hanging from trees. And they left the island and cursed it, saying it was bad medicine. They would never return to that island ever again. And when help came, those bodies were never found. And in the middle of that island is Lake Windigo. And there are stories of people finding giant holes in the lake with huge footprints coming out of the water leading to the island. Not as though somebody walked out to the lake and fell through, but the Windigo coming out hunting for prey. So during the winter, a couple colleagues and I went on a camping expedition to the area because the Windigo is associated with winter and cold. So we picked a cold weekend where the wind chill was about 30 degrees below zero. And we decided we were going to camp on the island right next to the lake. And what's interesting is that one night when we had a great base camp fire going, my colleague Noah and I were filming, going to the lake to try to conjure up the spirit of the Windigo. And as we were filming, Noah stopped and he said, "Our boots are crunching the snow too loud. Nobody's going to even hear what we're talking about. We have to be much quieter." And as we paused there for a moment, all of a sudden, something on our left startled us and really scared us. We couldn't see it, but it was big up in the trees. And the camera we're filming shows us both like ducking down. And most likely it was a bird of prey or even an owl. But we didn't see anything, but I can tell you it got our adrenaline going for the rest of the expedition.
Wow, I bet.
And that was an expedition where one of the ways that you can kill the Windigo is by pouring hot tallow down its throat. And tallow is a beef or moose or bear fat. It's a rendered fat. And it was thought that if you poured this down the Windigo's mouth, it would defrost its icy heart and it would die. Now, how you're supposed to pour it down his throat, Lon, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any proof of that ever happening.
No, but we did have our tallow hot on our fire the entire expedition, just in case. And again, I wasn't thinking that it would protect us against the Windigo, but there's something psychological when you're 3-hour hike across ice in the middle of nowhere, 30 degrees below zero. There's something psychological about having that protection, even if it would probably do you very little good.
Now, you have degrees in psychology. What is your take on this, the Windigo psychosis?
Yes, I believe. Now, as you mentioned in the great introduction, my background, I did both my bachelor's and master's degree in the field of psychology. I ended up doing my master's thesis on exploring students' belief in the paranormal. Now, Windigo psychosis is it's not in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, pretty much the Bible for anyone in the mental health field that's trying to diagnose disorders. But it is seen as more of a culture-bound syndrome, meaning that they believe that it's a mental illness that is contained within one specific culture or segment of the society, which would be, in our case, the First Nation people of Alberta Canada and across Canada. And I really see it as what we've dubbed as white-splaining, very similar to mansplaining, that now 400 plus years later, us educated Westerners can look back on the First Nation primitive people and say, this thing wasn't real. There were no Windigo creatures. They were simply suffering from a mental illness that came with this compulsion of violence and depression and this desire for human flesh and sometimes actual cannibalism. But I really have a lot of trouble with Windigo psychosis because, one, I think it's impossible to really know what the people of that era believed in unless you were there, unless you lived in their belief systems, unless you experienced what life was like. I think it's just too difficult centuries later to look at these stories and explain them away. Also, I think it discredits a lot of these stories, that there are many stories where people killed a suspected Windigo and found that their heart or their backbone or other organs seemed to be encased in ice. And they weren't misidentifying it. They weren't making these stories up. So if we take them for their word on it, you know, what was really happening? And I think Windigo psychosis too easily dismisses this as a mental disorder without looking at it as more of a complex social belief system.
Right. Do you believe that possession or someone who has had a spirit of one of these beings attached to them can actually physically change?
Well, that's the reports. A lot of the old original reports not only talked about mental transformations, but actual physical transformations. And one of the weirdest ones, first documented by Nathan Carlson in his Windigo research, was, and one we found in many cases as well, was this unexplained swelling of somebody that thought they were turning Windigo. They were starting to get really big and swollen, and many said they could not even recognize their loved one anymore, that their face had taken on a grotesque image, that they were terrified. And I think just diving back quick to that Windigo psychosis, one of the other components of it was that these things were done, these killings were done merely out of a convenience, that tribes people could kill their weak, their elderly, their frail, and then have the Windigo absolve them of any guilt because they could state, we weren't killing grandma or uncle, whoever. It was, they were turning Windigo. We were saving the community. Okay. But when you look at the original literature, it's completely opposite of that. So many of these people tried to save their loved ones. Often they would try to save them, tie them up, try to cure them for weeks on end. Now imagine you're in the middle of nowhere, no medical facilities, no doctors. Your shaman is trying to perform some medicine on this person who at night starts to struggle and say that if you let me out of these ropes, I'm going to grab an axe and kill you and eat you. And they do this screaming at you for weeks on end. But these people still tried to cure them, which is beyond, caring in my book. That, I think for a lot of people, 3 nights of that and that person's gone.
Yeah. Do you think there were any actual physical diseases that were either misidentified as Wendigo or maybe led to this?
Yes, I think it's easy to see a lot of the mental illness that may come around it. A lot of the things of the symptoms of Windigo psychosis or turning Windigo seem to mirror general disorders in mental disorders. As I said, being withdrawn, personality changes, feeling depressed, having no energy. Those type of things happen quite a bit in modern times with our mental illnesses as well. You also have to look at seasonal affect disorder, of how it affects today people in the U.S., where we've had the easiest living conditions than anyone in the history of this country in terms of we have heat, we have electricity, we have indoor plumbing, we have food, but yet the lack of sun still affects us and still puts people into, feeling low on energy and depressed. So I think that may have factored in as well. And it's certainly not the cause of it, but it might have been a condition that really settled in and made it even worse.
Wow. You look at these stories, legends, tales, and such. I mean, these people that were living in these settlements, these tribes, they must have been scared to death half the time.
Without a doubt, the Windigo, the fear of this creature was unlike anything I've ever researched. Any other creature, haunting, whatever it is, nothing compares to the fear of the Windigo. I'll give you two quick examples as to illustrate the fear. There's a story in Canada in the newspapers of a certain tribe that heard. They didn't see, they didn't hear it. They heard of the creature coming toward their village. Someone told them a Windigo was on the prowl. Be on the lookout. They didn't hear it, they didn't see it, but that fear was enough to keep them inside their shelters during the winter, so much so that they would not come out and hunt for game. Several of them starved to death because they would not leave their shelter on the mere whisper that a Windigo was in the area.
Wow.
And the other story, this is just crazy, the amount of effort they took to make sure that somebody going Windigo would not come back to haunt them or to curse them. There's a story up in the Lesser Slave Lake area of Alberta, Canada. And this story dates back to the 1899, the winter. And it involves a native First Nation man named Moosetoos. And he was going crazy. For many days, they tried to cure him. The shaman brought his best medicine, and nothing worked. And he said, I'm going to kill all of you. I'm going to eat you. Finally, the tribe could take it no longer. Several people hit him with an axe in the chest, splitting open his chest. And he dropped to the ground and was in the state of dying. But that wasn't enough for the people because they believed he would simply heal himself and get back up and come after them. So they drove a stake through the axe hole in his chest, pinning him to the ground in case he tried to get back up, that he would be actually pinned to the ground. But that wasn't enough for them. So as the hours went by that evening, they took that pin or that stake out of his chest and they poured hot tea in that hole, trying to defrost his icy heart. Then they simply did not give up. They tied his legs together with some chains, pinning him to the ground. They restaked him in the ground. And eventually, as daylight was coming, just to be certain he was dead, they chopped off his head.
Sounds a lot like the vampire Strigoi legends.
Well, again, does it make sense that if you're trying to get rid of a loved one who's no longer capable of being part of the society, don't you just strangle them or shoot them or do something? You're going through a lot of work to put on a show that you think is a Windigo. I mean, these people were absolutely terrified of the Windigo.
Wow. So, speaking of cures, what did they consider a cure, or was there no cure?
That's a tricky question and very confusing. And as we go through this, I want your listeners to try not only to keep these straight, but then try doing it when you're in the midst of a panic because a giant cannibalistic monster is outside your structure. So for curing it, there were several ways in which you could cure a Windigo, but only before it fully turned into a flesh and blood. And where that line was, where somebody who was possessed fully had turned, I don't know. It's very shady. But you could cure them through several means. One, as I mentioned, the hot tallow. Not only were they used to kill the Wendigo, but it was also thought that if somebody was turning Wendigo, you could pour hot tallow and it would cure them. It would defrost the heart before it fully became encased in ice. And a lot of skeptics and researchers claim that it was really that if you're starving to death, the influx of the heavily fat-containing tallow would do the body and the mind a lot of good in a short amount of time. That it wasn't that you were defrosting its icy heart, but you were simply providing nutrients that were lacking for so many months. So you could give it hot tallow. It could also be cured by a powerful shaman, like Jack Fiddler, who was one of the best-known Wendigo hunters of all time. He was said to be powerful enough to actually cure people of being a Wendigo. There's one case where Jack Fiddler was called by tribe members because a man was acting crazy in a tent and saying he was turning Wendigo. So Jack Fiddler simply showed up, picked the man up, started throwing him to the ground and whipping him, saying, if you turn into a Wendigo, I'm going to kill you. I have the power to do it. And according to the records, that worked. The man said the whipping and the fear of being killed by the shaman was enough to get rid of the Wendigo. It also happened where religious leaders could cure a Wendigo. Oftentimes, tribes people who were brought to the missionaries and the chapels that were there would often be cured. But again, was that due to the warm weather, the food, the dry living environment, or was it the power of belief that if you believe some higher power is going to cure you, whether it's a priest or a shaman, maybe it does have that curative effect.
Wow. Now, talking about the modern Wendigo and some of the stories associated with, now the only one I can really think of that's been documented is the individual who claimed he was a Wendigo or transformed into a Wendigo while aboard the Greyhound bus. I think that was 2008. I remember seeing this story. They were traveling from Edmonton to Winnipeg, and this guy just went completely nuts and started chewing on people.
Yes, Mr. Lee, who's now out of psychiatric care and is a free man, if you're looking to ride the Greyhound, he was on board the Greyhound. Now, what's interesting about this case is really, I think this was propped up in the media to be more than it was in terms of its connection to the Windigo, where it came out in court records that Mr. Lee believed he was hearing from the devil or aliens or something. It wasn't the Windigo. He believed that he was being told that if he didn't kill the person next to him, that person was a demon or was going to harm him in some way. So during the Greyhound ride, he simply turned to the man next to him who was sleeping with his earphones on and started stabbing him to death. And the bus driver pulled over and everybody scurried off the bus and they propped the doors closed, trapping Mr. Lee with the victim who was already deceased at that time. And that's when he cut off the head and was carrying it around through the windows like some sort of grisly trophy. And he did consume portions of his victim's body. And because it was in Canada and because of the cannibalism that transpired, that he was deemed a Windigo, even though it was never brought up about the Windigo. It was more of, demonic possession type where he was hearing voices. But I think if this would have happened anywhere else, it would not have had a Windigo label attached to it. When people were going crazy in Florida on bath salts and eating the faces off of one another, nobody brought up Windigo. Here in Wisconsin, when Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein resorted to cannibalism, nobody brought up the Windigo, even though we're in the Northwoods of the Great Lakes. So I think just because it was in Canada that it got this, and there's a whole section in the book where we address this because it got a lot of international news. And we were debating or tempted to try to contact Mr. Lee for an interview for the book, but we felt it best just to let that segment go a bit.
Yeah, I think that would have been an interesting interview. I mean, the fact that the guy's out now, I don't know if it has anything to say about the criminal justice system in Canada, but I really doubt that he would have been out walking around here in the United States. But then again, what do I know?
I would feel a little safer there with maybe a few more years of treatment before letting him out. But again, Canada is not only a whole different place politically and socially, but if you've never been to Canada, it's very difficult to overstate how vast and wild it is. That you can go 30 minutes out of a big city and you're in nowhere for miles and miles and miles. Nothing is around you except heavy, thick forest. It's, I grew up here in Wisconsin, and we have a lot of thick forest in the Northwoods. You can get lost pretty easily, but nothing compared to just how gigantic and desolate Canada is.
Oh, absolutely. I can attest to that. I used to spend time up in the Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario. And you're like in the middle of nowhere there.
It really does have. And that was one of the things when, for, 15 years or so, I had been researching Swift Runner, who I just talked about earlier, of consuming his family. And every story I tried to dig up about him, his court records, everything. But it wasn't until last year that I finally was able to go to the places where he lived and he died and he loved. And that's when it really set in. And I can tell you that I was not prepared for the emotional wallop that visit had on me. And for 20 some years, I've investigated serial killers, mob hits, all these haunted, gruesome places and people doing abhorrent things to one another. But I thought I was pretty immune to that. But there was something about just being in those thick wooded areas and putting myself in the view of his last young child that was traveling with him, having to know that he was next in line for the axe, that it was just something that even now, 7-8 months later, on cold Wisconsin nights, I'm still struck with that chill from Swift Runner just because of the brutality of that case.
Oh, I can imagine that sticks with you. My God. I mean, and especially as desolate those areas are, and that these stories are coming out of those areas. And of course, people, I imagine some of the people you talk to up there really kind of added to the flavor of the story.
It really was. And it was fun to see the differences between sometimes you'd talk with an old timer that would have more of a personal story of hearing these legends as they grew up. And then oftentimes you'd talk to younger people, teenagers, and they knew of the story. And oftentimes they knew of it as a legend. There was this, we were in a town and we spoke with this a waitress at a local diner. And she told us the story in her town where the Windigo was said to have been chopped up into several pieces and spread out to the four corners of the town and buried so it could never come back. But even to that day, they were kind of apprehensive that the body might reform itself and come back seeking revenge.
I found one part of your book very interesting where you mentioned how the creatures in Game of Thrones are actually in George R. Martin's novel are very similar to the Wendigo, the White Walkers. Do you believe that was done on purpose, or you just believe that's just the way it turned up?
No, I believe that. And that chapter was written by my co-author, Kevin Nelson. And we talked about it, and we think it was done on purpose. That, again, it's taking that innate fear that humans have of this tall, grotesque, thin-looking monster of ice, and just how terrifying that would have been. It's much like with the new Antlers movie that is scheduled for release next year now, Del Toro's new movie, where they get into a Windigo story without overly stating that it's a Windigo, leaving it up to your interpretation. And I think at some places that's even scarier than labeling it the Windigo, because now your imagination goes crazy.
Wow. Well, Del Toro would be the perfect person to do a movie like that.
Yeah, and again, it's called Antlers, and it has more of that modern view of the Windigo as this antlered monster. If any of your listeners are fans of the TV show Supernatural, they did an episode where it had antlers as well. And a lot of people now think that's the modern Windigo. And in some regards, it is. Because when these legends and folklore, when they progress and morph through decade after decade, at some point that does become the legend.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this, and this is something I just thought of. You hear of people that develop or manifest thought forms or tulpas. Do you believe there's a possibility that some of these entities could actually been manifested by the mind?
Without a doubt. And my colleague Kevin Nelson, who's much more schooled in the occult than I am, did a chapter on the shamans and what role they played with the Windigo. Because not only would they be called upon to fight the Windigo in the spirit world in a shaking tent, where they would go in and call in spirits and animals to help them fight the Windigo, they could also summon it. And whether they were summoning it out of the ancient ice forest or out of reality or out of creation, we don't know. But a powerful shaman was said to be able to create one of these things and send it to do its bidding. So it's very likely that these things could have materialized out of nowhere. Again, so much of the lore of the Windigo was lost to history because people, when you're on the verge of starvation, you're not sitting down with a notebook writing down legends. You're trying to survive. So much of the oral stories were lost over the last 300 years that I think you could do 10 more books on what was lost. But I certainly think that the belief in the Windigo had some effect not only on its appearing and summoning, but also its behavior.
Now, before we end the show, can you tell us another older story about a Wendigo possession?
Yes. This is a great story. And this happened, well, let me first state that Windigo, the creatures could be male or female. Many people thought they were genderless, but no, they were often reported as having a gender. There are even occasional reports of Windigo creatures living with one another in almost a pack of some sort. But This story involves Marie Coutray, and this goes back to the 1800s as well. And she was traveling with her husband and his son. It was her son-in-law. It was her second marriage. Her first marriage with all of her children ended terribly, as though she was cursed. She started losing her husband and all of the children in freak accidents and deaths. But anyway, she's traveling with her husband and his son. And she starts to act very strange, where the husband notices weird things are happening a few days into their trek. So over the course of the next week, she starts turning into a Windigo, even telling her husband, "I'm turning into a Windigo. Help me. I do not want to harm you. I do not want to kill you. You have to kill me." And the husband and the son said, "We cannot kill you. We love you too much. We will cure you." So for the next 21 days, they spent every moment trying to cure her. They could not. They eventually ended up having to kill her. and they killed her with an axe and then buried her body right away. Now, the interesting thing is, Lon, that when you killed a suspected Wendigo, the only real way to make sure that it would never come back was to cremate it, burn it so not one piece of it remained. Otherwise, the belief was it would repair itself, go back into the woods, and wait for someone to go hunting and then possess them. But they didn't cremate her. They just simply buried her. And again, the white law enforcement found out about this and arrested the husband and his son. They were eventually convicted and spent 6 months in prison for this murder. But most of the murders of the suspected Wendigo, they were done by family members, which cut down on the idea of retaliation from somebody who might not have agreed with it. Because it was a family, they were expected to do this. And many times they were forced to do it, where the entire community or the tribe would say, you have to do it to save the rest of us. But Marie Coutray was buried along the shores of Lesser Slave Lake. Her grave, which is unmarked, is still up there. And those who know Wendigo lore know that she was never cremated. And I can tell you, while we were walking around, we had our hands on our hatchets just in case.
I bet you did.
You know, it's Canada. There are no guns allowed, which wouldn't have helped us anyway. But our hatchets certainly gave us some sense of safety. And that area in Alberta also had stories going back to the 1700s of a place called Eating Creek and Eating Creek Road, where it was said that one of these flesh and blood Wendigos actually lived for many years. And it would often consume people. And tribesfolk would often tell any white missionaries or fur traders to avoid that area lest they be eaten by this giant Wendigo.
Wow. So, Chad, what do you have coming up in the future? Appearances, books? What's up?
Yeah, I'm right now and let me tell you, I've done 25 books on the paranormal, 20 years of doing this. I think this is the most important work that I've done and the most complex, puzzling, and hardest work of research that I've done. As you and I were talking earlier, you know, I've done this for 20 years with the Windigo and still feel like I know very little about the legend. So I'm shifting over right now and doing something a little less serious, where my next book is going to be on supernatural dares, where people dare one another to do things at these places where if you sit on the mausoleum, the ghost of the people buried inside will come out and haunt you, those type of things.
Wow.
So a little less serious than the Windigo, because this really was, a book that had profound impact on me.
It's a marvelous book. I mean, like I told you earlier, it's one subject that I've really never have been very good at recognizing the phenomena, and but I have learned a lot from the book, and I've learned a lot from you talking tonight. Now, the book is titled Wendigo Lore, Monsters, Myths, and Madness. And I highly recommend it. I really do. It's fantastic. And I agree with you. I think it's your best book so far.
And one last thing for your listeners is that the Windigo not only could possess people, it could possess, obviously, the old, but also babies. There are stories of babies being killed after trying to eat at their mother and chew on them. And also animals could turn Windigo. So all of your listeners out there getting ready for bed or whatever they're doing, no one is safe from the Windigo.
Well, definitely get this book and make sure you read it right before you go to sleep.
Perfect advice.
Right. So, Chad, thanks again for coming on the show. It's always great talking to you. And when the next book comes out, I will definitely have you on.
Thank you, and keep an eye out.
Okay, you take care now. Now, if you've had an unexplained encounter or sighting, feel free to contact me through the Phantoms and Monsters blog site. Now, if you're interested in supporting Phantoms and Monsters and Arcane Radio, You can use the PayPal donation buttons on the blog or the newsletter. Your continued support is always appreciated. Now, our new YouTube channel, Beyond Explanation, has new content being added every day, including Arcane Radio Archive shows. So check it out and subscribe. I want to again thank Chad Lewis for joining me this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to the show. Good night, stay healthy, and have a safe and enjoyable weekend.